Hello people of the internet, it's Darryl Syms here. Today I want to talk to you about how to break out of the typical boxes of scales when you're trying to improvise and songwrite and just play guitar in general, you know. So this applies to any sort of scale pattern that you're learning, whether it's the pentatonic scale, the major scale, Lydian, Phrygian, Aeolian, any of the modes. But for the purpose of this video I just want to stick to the pentatonic shape. So more than likely, the very first pentatonic shape that you'll ever learn will sound a bit like this. Which I agree is one of the best shapes ever to learn. But there's a stage that you might get to where you know that scale off by heart, you know it behind your head, blindfolded, and you can play that all day long. But you find yourself exhausting the scale so much that you kind of aren't really enjoying it anymore. So I'm going to give you a few key tips on how to break out of that box. Now the first thing that you should know is your 5 pentatonic shapes. There are 5 notes in the pentatonic scale. Therefore there are 5 shapes across the neck to learn. So I'm not going to go over those 5 shapes in this video. This video is more aimed at those who already know those shapes but tend to find themselves always going back to the home shape, the first shape here, and maybe aren't very comfortable with the other shapes yet and find it difficult trying to remember them. So a strategy that I used to do to remember these shapes is take 2 strings and go through each pentatonic scale on just those 2 strings. Until you know those strings very well, so that you can jam in your first shape. But you can also include those 2 strings. Just 2 strings to start with, no big deal. Once you master those strings though, you can obviously increase that and add 3 strings perhaps. So rather than just all of that, you can kind of include that 3rd string. So already you're starting to expand your confidence, hopefully. Obviously this will take a while, but the more strings that you add to your note bank, obviously the more comfortable you're going to get with the entire scale, but it's important that you just start with 2 strings at first and then move on from there. Another little tip that I want to throw out there is, rather than thinking sort of scalular, as in going down and up each scale, try and go across between them, sort of horizontally. So for example, let's take those bottom 2 strings again. So rather than, sort of that sort of thing, you're really focusing on just using one finger and really feeling those notes and listening out to which note you should be landing on. So I always try and encourage people, if you want to break out of scale shapes, then you've got to travel horizontally and really use your ear to dictate which note you're going to land on next. Because when we learn scales, we're so used to going vertically up and down the guitar, and you really do learn those patterns and learn which fingers to use. But when you're going horizontally, you kind of get a bit lost and you will have to rely on your ear. One last little tip that I want to give is try and just focus on 2 of the pentatonic scales to begin with. So for example, your first shape and your 5th shape, you're the one behind, okay? Could be the one in front, but always choose one that's next to the one that you're learning. And from there, just jam. Don't worry too much about phrasing and technique at this point. Really just feel the notes. And then jump back to the previous shape. And then back to the first. So perhaps choose that first shape, play around with a few notes. And then mix that with the previous one. So really just focus on those two shapes, and if you find yourself getting a little bit lost and you are playing with the unfamiliar shape and you hit a point where you're like, uh-oh, I'm kind of lost, always remember that first shape is your safe zone, you know, so jump back to that safe zone just temporarily whilst you get your bearings and then, you know, explore outside. And eventually over time you won't be adding one shape, you're going to be adding the other shape, the other side of that first shape. So you'll have your fifth shape, your first and your second shape, and then you can include your third and your fourth, of course, and all of your shapes across the neck. Just always remember that safe zone is your first shape. Branch out as much as you're comfortable with, and as soon as you hit a dead zone, jump back to the safe spot and work your way back to where you were until you're super comfortable with what you're playing. And like I said, the intentions of this video is really just to get you familiar with the notes outside of that box shape. Whatever scale it is that you're doing, you will always start off with a box shape, which is completely fine, but expand that box to more boxes and you'll still find yourself in box shapes, and that's why I kind of encourage you to travel more vertically across the guitar, because that really does break you out of the boxes. But the idea of the boxes to begin with is just to get you familiar and comfortable with the notes.